Well, just in case you get confused between us, I'm the one with the non-duct taped Bible.
You got scotch tape on it.
And then, one, not so much difference as different angle of approach. You know, I know that Paul is anxious to get to the theological implications of this text. I'm of the mind that we do well as Christians to, before we immediately proceed to the theological meaning of the text, we look at it in its plain meaning in the real world. In other words, this is a story about real workers in a real field, in a real world. And that's because, you know, so much of the way that we read the Bible is if it took place in Disneyland, in some place far, far away, and we forget that all of the issues we struggle with today, and these are issues we struggle with: what's a fair wage, how do workers and managers get along, and so on. This is also Jesus' world, and if we want to be following Jesus in our real world, we have to be able to understand his story in his real world. Does that make any sense? And so before leaping to the sort of theological implications, I think it's important to understand the message. This story is an economic story. As Paul outlined, it's a story about a vineyard harvest. Now, the setting is that you've got a landowner and you've got a bunch of day laborers. Now, that is not a world that dropped from the sky. That was a world that was created by social and political and economic forces in the Roman Empire. In a word, fewer and fewer people held more and more of the land. And because of economic forces generated by the elites of the Roman Empire, a lot of Palestinian smallholders, small farmers, small business people had lost their land, usually through foreclosure. Is this sounding familiar?
What?
This is an ancient dynamic of economies to privilege the few and to disinherit the many. And that was very intensely true in first century Palestine. So the setting of this story is not a fairy tale setting, it's a real world setting in which you have lots of day laborers and you have a landowner. That's the first thing. Second thing, this is a grape harvest. God knows here in the Ojai Valley, we still harvest grapes. And all throughout Southern California, lots of vineyards. Now, as you know, the time to harvest grapes is when the sugar content is right. And today there's all kinds of chemistry to test that. In antiquity, you had to watch and taste each day. And you couldn't predict whether it was going to be next week or the middle of next month or tomorrow. So when the grapes taste right, the time is now. You've got to go out and get a bunch of workers. It's kind of a hard thing to plan for. And that's the scenario here. As it says, it was time to pick grapes and he had to go out and find workers. Now the scenario of the day laborers, I'm glad you mentioned Miners Oaks and the day laborers there, because day laborers standing on the street corners is a phenomenon all around Southern California. This is, again, the result of economic disparity in our real world. In this case, these workers are standing in the marketplace of the village. They're hired, and the text says, and he negotiated a wage.
Right.
Now, that's actually a very unusual sentence. Usually the owner would set the wage, but because the owner needs workers and needs them now, there's a little bit of power with the workers to negotiate their wage. And so they are the ones who named the denarius, which, as Paul said, was considered a fair, living wage in the first century. So off they go. And as Paul said, it's very unusual for a landowner to go in the first place to hire workers, but to return 5 times to the marketplace gives you a sense of how urgent it was to keep getting workers. And it also shows that there were lots and lots of day laborers, which is a sign of a bad economy. And so you get to the end of the parable and you see this very extraordinary moment where he decides to pay the last hired first. Now, in an honor culture, and Paul's talked a lot, I know
this is a big honor-shame issue, yeah.
Big honor-shame issue.